Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Creative Piecemeal Podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Today I am with board-certified music therapist, Ami Kunimura. She's the founder of the Self-Care Institute and a writer and speaker, in addition to being a board-certified music therapist. She provides therapeutic support for professionals around the world who are experiencing burnout, and she's the creator and facilitator of Resilience Over Burnout, a self-care program, an in-depth online program that guides professionals out of burnout and stress cycles through research-based self-care practices. She's also the author of Resilience Over Burnout, a self-care guide for music therapists. Ami was on the podcast a few months back in a more of a fun, lighthearted episode. We got to dig into some of her favorite music and how she began her journey as a music therapist. But today's special episode is digging deep into one of her passions, burnout, resilience, and self-care. And this episode is specifically for music therapy students and music therapy professionals. But if you find yourself listening to this and you're not a music therapist, we welcome you and hope you learn something new. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Really glad to be here, Tammy.
I'm so excited that you're here and we get to do this special episode. I certainly hope that we can continue with this trend in the future. If you could do me a favor and tell our listeners a little bit more about your program and the books and what is available to music therapy professionals and students right now who may be needing that resource.
Sure, I'll be happy to. So yeah, like you just said, I'm the founder of the Self-Care Institute. And through the Self-Care Institute, I do offer continuing education courses, but also just resources for music therapists and other helping professionals regarding burnout prevention, burnout recovery, stress management, and just support for self-care. So my most popular resource is a 31 CMTE course called Resilience Over Burnout, a self-care program. It's 31 CMT credits, so it is a very long program, but it's meant to be long for a certain reason. With self-care, it's not like we can just, learn about it in 2 hours and expect our behavior to change and heal from burnout and, everything's good and we feel fulfilled in life and work. Self-care itself does take some work and effort. And, when we look at our own self-care behaviors, oftentimes what needs to change is our beliefs about ourselves and our beliefs around what self-care is, what it means to be a working professional. And that takes time. It takes some self-reflection. Sometimes it takes some, moments of being really honest with ourselves. And that's not always easy. And so this is a long program. It's an online program. I open enrollment twice a year. And, but it is one of the resources that I'm the most proud of. It was a resource that took the most amount of work for me, but I'm also proud of it because this is what I wish existed when I went through burnout myself. And it's out there so that, professionals who are experiencing burnout have a place to go where there is research-based information that's there to support them, but also so that they don't have to go through the experience alone. Burnout and isolation is a very scary pairing when you have burnout and then you have the isolation, and those two things mixing together just makes both of those experiences worse. And so I wanted to create a place where people could come together and talk about their experiences in a safe place and get support. And so, again, that is my biggest, most popular program out there. But I also have other options too. My first self care resource I ever put together was an ebook. And the ebook is called Resilience Over Burnout, a self care guide for music therapists. This one is specific to music therapists, and it can be read just as an ebook alone. I highly recommend this for students or interns. This ebook is a required text in some undergraduate programs, which I'm really happy about. But this can also be taken as a CMTE course, also as a 3 credit course, because it comes with a workbook that you can go through while you're reading through the ebook and do the work in it. So you can get credit for that too. So that's sort of a lighter version and just more surface level, but it's a good place to start when it comes to having self-care support. So I do have that ebook, then I have my online program, but I also have free resources too at selfcareinstitute.com. I have articles about self-care. I have a blog on there, but I also have another free resource that I send out an email every Wednesday in my email newsletter called Take a Moment. And this email sometimes provides self care education. I talk about the latest self care research or the latest research on burnout, but I'm also there to provide some tools and some encouragement for self care too, because, self care, it's not like we just learn about it one time. Self care does require sort of this very consistent, compassionate, gentle nudges. And so I specifically send it out on Wednesdays so it can come in the middle of our week when sometimes we need it the most. Either it comes as, a reminder to breathe, or again, some information on what self care truly is or what we need to be aware of when it comes to burnout. So those are my resources. And again, you can find them at selfcareinstitute.com.
Thank you. And I get the email newsletter every Wednesday,
Oh,
and it's definitely
cool.
something that I look forward to.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thanks for receiving that. But yeah, it's one of my favorite things that I do. And, I do like to be able to provide some free resources for people and to also stay connected with everyone, just once a week. That email right now, it goes out to about like 12,000 people, which is, yeah, nice to feel connected to people all over the world in that way. It's fun to also get replies to the email that I sent out and see who writes back every week. Yeah.
Yeah, that's impressive and so wonderful. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, for those joining who may not know exactly what
Mhm.
burnout and resilience and self care are, can you take a moment to explain that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, when we're talking about burnout here, um, I'm specifically talking about occupational burnout, the burnout we might experience at work as working professionals. And it's important to distinguish that because there are different types of burnout out there. There's activist burnout, there's parental burnout, there's also academic burnout, which is important to know. Students can burn out, so can interns. I've worked with a lot of people who have burnt out before they even started their career. And that's a little bit scary, but that can sometimes provide some important information about things that need to change when one does become a working professional. But so when we're talking about burnout here, I'm going to specifically be talking about occupational burnout. And so with occupational burnout, what we're looking at is 3 different things in this experience. The first thing here is the experience of emotional exhaustion and just feeling emotionally depleted. As music therapists, our jobs do require being in emotional spaces, and that can require being an emotional support to someone. It can also involve emotional music that we're exposed to, or that intimate emotional space of music itself is such an emotional experience, and so we are at risk for becoming emotionally exhausted when that just becomes too much. The emotional exhaustion, it usually is the most common and the most, it's just the easiest part of burnout to kind of spot and recognize within ourselves, because we know that feeling of just being sort of depleted emotionally. So that's the first part. The second part of burnout is a change in attitude. So, in research, this is called depersonalization, when you have like a change in attitude towards your own work. But this can also be a change in attitude towards your own clients or towards yourself. So, it can be the feeling of, maybe not having as much passion or love for your work as you used to, or change in attitude towards your clients. Or sometimes when someone's experiencing burnout and they're so tired at work, they might feel a little resentful towards their clients because they don't have much to give to them, yet they have to keep giving, and that's so hard. But that change in attitude can be a marker of burnout. And then, one more thing to mention on that is a change in attitude towards music can also be an important thing for music therapists to be aware of when it comes to that depersonalization experience. And then the third thing in burnout is a decreased sense of personal accomplishment. So this can range from feeling just like a failure at work, or it can be that feeling of like, I'm trying so hard at work, but yet I'm not accomplishing what I want to. I'm not reaching my goals, even though I'm putting all this effort into it, or that like one is no longer feeling like they're effective at work anymore for some reason. So again, with burnout, these three things are the emotional exhaustion, the depersonalization or that change in attitude, and then this decreased sense of accomplishment at work. And again, we're talking about occupational burnout here. And so that's sort of how the World Health Organization classifies burnout. It's classified as a syndrome. So a syndrome is something that just has, a certain amount of symptoms there. I think it is important to know that every person's individual experience of burnout does matter too. So someone might have other experiences or other just other things that they're going through that does fit into their burnout experience, that is a symptom of burnout that maybe doesn't fit into those three categories but still matters. And so we don't want to just say that burnout is just those three things. Those are the most common things, but it can encompass a bigger range of experiences. So that's burnout. Any questions before I talk about resilience? Was that clear?
Yeah, I'm good on my end.
Okay, cool. So resilience is an important word to talk about when we're talking about burnout. And so I want to start with resilience, about what resilience is not. So resilience does not mean being strong all the time. Like that's not really what we're aiming for, even with self-care. To be a resilient person doesn't mean you have to be this strong, like superhero who is saving everybody and saving yourself and, somehow maintaining this perfect work-life balance. What resilience means is that there is the presence of struggle or hardship or challenge. And, as human beings, that is a universal experience. We will experience suffering and pain and stress. And, sometimes this will come in our great moments in life. Sometimes this will come in the harder moments of life. But when we talk about resilience, what we're looking at is, in general, resilience can be the ability to pick ourselves back up after we've fallen down in some way. And that falling down, it could be literal, but it could also be the emotional falling down, or, the maybe a decrease in our own mental health, or just slipping back in some way. But resilience can mean picking ourselves up. But I do like to look at resilience as doing so in a compassionate way. So it's not like yelling at yourself, like, get up off the ground, like, you made a mistake, you make it right. Like, no, that's not resilience. That's just being hard on yourself. But resilience does involve compassion. And another way I like to look at resilience is resilience can also mean responding with self-care. So responding to stress with self-care in big ways and in small ways. So it can be, going through our daily lives and, you make a small mistake. Like say it's like, making a typo in an email that you just really wanted it to be good. It's like, oh, that feeling like, oh no, I made a mistake. Resilience can mean taking a breath in, forgiving yourself for making that mistake, knowing that, it's common to make spelling errors, and then being able to move on, either correcting the mistake or, letting it go in some way. But resilience can also look like bigger things, like, when you're going through grief or something, allowing yourself some space to feel those feelings and allowing yourself to go through the emotional experience rather than avoiding it. That can be resilience too. So again, is not about being strong all the time. It's allowing ourselves to be human and to be in the human experience, but being compassionate with ourselves at the same time as we try to take steps forward for ourselves. And then when it comes to self care, so self care and resilience are very much related because, again, self care is a form of resilience. When we do choose to care for ourselves, that is a very strong act of resilience. And so the way I like to look at self care is, at the basic level and very, very obvious level here, self care means caring for yourself. But I do want to emphasize that self care means caring for yourself in all of your roles in life, not just your personal life. So, this means taking care of yourself as a professional, taking care of yourself as maybe as an activist if you are one, or as a parent if you are one, or any number of identity factors that might come in that play into your personal role, your social roles, or who you see yourself as in this world, and being able to care for yourself and your own identity in these different ways. So again, it's not just your personal life. So self care is not just something that happens like after work in your free time. And also, self care includes action and mindset. So self care is not just about our behaviors. We sometimes think about, what can I do for self care? Maybe I'll meditate or eat healthy or like go for a jog or something. But it's a lot of doing, a lot of action, and that's very important. But that's only one piece of self care. The other piece of self care is a mindset piece of making sure that we are being kind to ourselves within our own being. So, being kind to yourself in your own mind, having your self talk or your internal dialogue be one that's compassion and not compassionate, rather than super critical or mean or, judgmental. And it can be easy to go to that judgy, critical, harsh voice, especially when we're tired and burnt out or when we're going through a hard time. But again, self care is being respectful of ourselves through our mindset and through our actions too. So, yeah, so that's burnout, resilience, self care.
I was actually curious for music therapists specifically, do you see certain patterns or symptoms of behavior that are specific to music therapists going through burnout? Like, do music therapists suddenly like really don't want to play these 10 songs because they hear them all the time, or do they find that they can't listen to music for enjoyment? Like, what happens for music therapists? Like, are there, I mean, obviously everyone goes through their own journey, but are there some things that you've noticed over the years that are really
Yeah, that's a good
specific?
question. So, yeah, so this can be related to like symptoms of burnout that are specific to music therapists. And you just touched on one, and that is, how our relationship to music can change. And that can look like one's music involvement just slowly decreasing, because well, I also know this feeling of, you're playing music all day with your client. Sometimes the last thing you want to do is play more guitar when you get home, even if it's for yourself, even if it's for self-care. Or, music is also very stimulating, and to be around a lot of sound all day can be tiring. And so sometimes when we get in our car, we to go drive home, we might not want to be listening to music in our car. We might want a podcast, or just some silence too would be nice. And so that can be okay in our change in relationship with music. But when we start to feel a loss of connection to music over time, this can be a symptom of burnout, when like a music therapist just starts to like or love music a little bit less than they used to, or the relationship changes to one where, music can't be a support for them anymore, and instead it's just a support they use with their clients. That's a pretty big loss, because most of us become music therapists for a few reasons. Because one, we love music, because we ourselves have experienced music being a support or a healing force in our lives, and because we believe in the power of music. But when our own actions don't match up with that anymore, when we stop believing in that for ourselves, that does impact our clinical work, our own attitude towards our work. And that can sometimes either be a symptom of burnout, or it can lead to burnout. And so I do encourage music therapists to just be mindful of your relationship to music. And again, change is going to be natural. We will naturally go through changes. We can't expect like, oh, I'm just going to love music exactly the same way throughout my whole life. I know that's going to change like any other relationship. But like other relationships, it will take effort to maintain. And so we do need to make sure we do still have time with the music that we do love, or playing music for ourselves, even when we are tired, or if we're too tired, to let that be a sign of we need to manage our energy a little bit differently to save some energy for making music on our own. But actually, I do have another CMTE course I just remembered. It's because it's not specifically self care, but I just released this course in January, and it's called Honoring Your Relationship with Music. This is a 4-credit CMTE course, and it's specifically about this. It's about reflecting on your own relationship with music, seeing how it has changed, and reconnecting with parts that may have been lost, or making new connections in reevaluating your own relationship with music. Because this is something I went through when I was going through burnout too, where I found myself just listening to music less, playing music less, and to me it felt like I was giving music away, and that there wasn't much left for me. And that was a big loss for me, because music is one of the biggest loves of my life. And to lose that love, it was scary. And it was a support that I couldn't afford to lose. I needed to get that back, and had to work at that to get that back. But with music therapists, though, some other symptoms of burnout that might be common are being exhausted by advocacy efforts. And so, one thing about being a music therapist is we are a professional minority. So, in the United States, there's like, about 9,000 board certified music therapists right now. And that's not very much. Like, there's millions of nurses, millions of teachers, and like 9,000 music therapists. Like, we can be stretched pretty thin. And there's not a whole lot of us in the workforce. And so because that does make us a minority, and because we are a minority, we can experience minority stress. And a lot of us experience minority stress through our advocacy efforts, where we have to either constantly explain what we do as music therapists. We sometimes have to constantly advocate for our own worth as professionals, saying I'm my role here is of value, and here's why. And having to explain that can sometimes be tiring, discouraging, and it takes a lot of energy. But advocacy, it is something that is part of our role as music therapists, because we are a professional minority. But when that does start to become very draining, sometimes that can lead to burnout, or be a symptom of burnout. But yeah, that is one symptom I see more commonly in music therapists than in other helping professionals, because it's just an extra layer of sort of responsibility that we have as a professional minority. Yeah. And then another one is that's related to music is sort of this It's related to the intimate space of music that we're in. And, music therapists are at risk for burnout, but this makes sense because our jobs are very physical. As musicians, we have a very physical job, not just playing music for us, and especially vocalists, like you are your instrument, or your hands are playing your guitar, or it takes our body and our energy to do what we do. But I also means like carrying around instruments. To me, that's one of the hardest parts was the actual transportation of my instruments and like lugging all this stuff around. Or for a lot of music therapists, it means moving furniture around rooms, or like just keeping track of a lot of these things physically. And at the same time, our jobs are very emotional. We go into these very deep emotional places with other people in their human experiences, and that's not easy either. And the combination of that can take a toll on people. And so I've seen it commonly with music therapists who are experiencing burnout. They're having both physical and emotional exhaustion at the same time. And when you have physical and emotional exhaustion, it's likely you're going to be experiencing mental exhaustion at the same time, because then your mind is trying to compensate for all that. And that's very tiring too.
Do you find that this happens to people who've been in the profession for 5 years or longer, or is it really sort of across the board, like new professionals as well as veterans?
So it is across the board, but it's most common in new professionals. So professionals who are in their career in their first 5 years of their career. And that's what the research shows about burnout across the board in all professions. And at first, this was really surprising to me to read this in the research, like that younger and professionals were actually at more risk for burnout. Because I had thought, and this is part of why I had a hard time recognizing burnout in myself when I was going through this like 15 years ago, was I was going through burnout as a new professional, and I didn't think it was burnout because I didn't think young people went through this. I thought, oh, it's probably just happens when you're older and like you're kind of just over it and you want to, retire and get on with your life. But that's actually not even what burnout is. Research has shown that it is more experienced professionals who are more resilient. And when we look at the challenges of being a new professional, this does make sense because, in your first 5 years of your career, there's some insecurities to deal with. There's also a lot of learning that happens, and learning takes a lot of energy. But there's also certain things that people deal with, like imposter syndrome, or, dealing with certain learning curves at work, or feeling like they're not enough, or, being able to just learn things that they weren't able to learn in school or their internship. But I think, like I mentioned before, some people are already coming into the profession with already some burnout because they were experiencing burnout as a student or as an intern. And so coming into the profession already in a weakened state also puts them at risk for burnout. And you think like, you know, being a music therapy intern, it is hard. Most of us have done this without pay and doing this full time, and there's so much learning to be had in internship, like you're being evaluated, so there's that certain amount of stress. And so, there's already that fatigue that's there, and then coming into being a new professional with that, sometimes it can be very challenging for people.
With your course and your book being required in some music therapy programs, it sounds like the programs are aware of this and are really working
Yes.
towards arming their students with the right tools.
Yes. So there is a bigger awareness now of burnout, burnout prevention, and even, the word self-care, like getting that into music therapy curriculums is a big deal, I think, because I don't remember hearing the word self-care as a student. I really, really wish I did. And so it's part of the work I'm doing now is to be able to provide that education to others so that these can be conversations that are had within our profession, but also conversations that can be had before becoming a professional.
What are some
Mhm.
tips that you think would be helpful across the board, whether they have the book or don't have the book?
Yeah, so my biggest tip when it comes to either learning about self care or just starting your own burnout prevention journey is to get to know yourself, because there really isn't like universal self care strategies I can give that's going to work for anybody. Because with self care, it does need to be personalized to each person, your identity, your culture, like your preferences, what you enjoy doing or don't enjoy doing, what your own abilities are. Like this all really matters when it comes to self-care. And so self-care does need to be personalized. And in order to personalize self-care for ourselves, we need to get to know ourselves. But the beauty in that is getting to know yourself is an act of self-care. So it's not like we're going to do this to like later practice self-care. Like, no, it starts with self-care. So it already puts you in this cycle of self-care. And so by getting to know yourself, one way you can do that is to think about what kind of music therapist am I or do I want to be? Because there are so many different ways to be a music therapy professional. There are lots of different people to work with. There's lots of different clientele. There's lot different music therapy techniques. Not everybody has to go lead a really, big like improvisational like drum circle or something, or not everyone has to go like lead a gentle, like guided imagery with music experience. You can fit your personality into your work and to think about, what kind of music therapy do I want to be? What would feel most natural to me? And to also think about when it comes to self-care, like what first would be the easiest for you? What does feel natural as far as taking care of yourself? Like for some people, like it seems awesome to go put on your running shoes and go for a jog for 3 miles. And like, it's not a big deal. For someone else, like that would just seem awful. And so you gotta know which one of those people you are. And if it seems awful, then to be able to choose something else. Well, what would feel good for you? What would be some sort of easy for you? What would be a good place to start? But also to know that when it comes to self-care, it's not, just about exercise or diet, because that all does need to be personalized, especially like what we eat and we want to nourish our bodies with. But with self-care, this also involves saying no to things and setting boundaries. And so that also is going to be very personalized to you, of what you're going to say no to, what kind of boundaries you're going to maintain, and how you're going to do that. So saying no is not the easiest thing for a lot of people. And so there are different ways to say no, but that's a good example of like a self-care practice that will need to be implemented, but that each one of us will have our own ways of saying no, and we'll have very specific things that we will need to say no to for our own health and well-being. So, yeah, starting with just getting to know yourself is a really good place to start when it comes to self care and burnout prevention, because each one of us will have different obstacles to self care, and each one of us will have different stressors we're dealing with too. And so it's good to know, what kind of risk factors we do have for burnout or stress, and acknowledging, being honest with ourselves with what's there, but also acknowledging our own preferences and honoring our own lives and what we're dealing with in this given moment in life.
And that's such an excellent tip and excellent advice. I definitely think that an internship is one of the most amazing experiences that a young music therapist can go through. And it really pushes you
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to the limit, because you're working on your coursework and you've got your internship, and like you said, you're being evaluated, and most of the time there's not a stipend attached, so it really pushes you
Yeah.
to the limits, because maybe you're also working a job in addition
Yeah.
to everything. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
I honestly think that for some people, being an internship is going to be more stressful and more difficult than their first
Yeah.
year on the job.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a good warning and just good something to keep in mind. Yeah, because there are multiple stressors. And so, yeah, my heart goes out to you, any intern who's listening right now. But we do get through it. And yeah, self-care is essential during internship.
Indeed, indeed. I
Mhm.
absolutely adored my internship. I
Yeah.
I'm one of those people who would go back and
Hmm.
and do it over again just because it really helped me grow. And like you said, I found myself and I found my place because of internship. and
Yeah. Oh,
and it
cool.
was just fantastic. But there were still stressors in life and still the need for
Yeah.
self-care. Like, even if you've
Hmm.
got a great placement and a fantastic internship that you love going to, there's still those stressors, there's still those factors
Yeah.
where you need to take care of yourself so you can be there for
Yes.
your patients.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Have you noticed, in this sort of semi post pandemic world, specific or new or different challenges that music therapists are facing right now that are leading them to become burnt out or leading them to your program now, whereas maybe they'd be led by different reasons before?
Yes, so the pandemic was a very big deal for music therapists. And I mean, you know, for a lot of music therapists, they had to take their work onto Zoom or virtually somehow. And that was a huge shift that had to happen. And other changes too happened for music therapists. And this huge amount of change was a very big stressor. And I think it was a stressor not just for individuals, but for the music therapy profession as a whole. And it also brought out our resourcefulness and our resilience. But what I'm seeing though is that change took a toll on us of constantly having to navigate and learning how to do our work in new ways. And that was very tiring. And what I'm seeing now is sort of this recovery from it, where the recovery looks like, being able to work now in different ways. I see a lot of music therapists, still doing some of their work virtually, doing some of their work in person, but, being very adaptable. But, this also did give us other options. But that response to the change, I just feel like there's this recovery period that's happening where it's almost like grieving or mourning the way our
Hmm.
work used to be, because it's just, for some music therapists, can just be a little bit more complicated now, and sort of this grieving for simpler times is what I'm seeing. But I'm also seeing grief, though, show up on different levels, and not just at work, but so many people right now are going through grief in different ways. And that does impact our work because grief and burnout are very much related and tied together. But, it can be so hard to go through all the changes we went through while still trying to support our clients who are going through the similar changes too, and trying to be strong for them. And, like, my wish for everyone is that we could all just like pause and just take a breath together and give ourselves credit for all that we've been able to navigate over the past few years, and to honor our own resilience, but again, to not put pressure on ourselves to still have everything figured out. We still doesn't mean that, oh, now we have to know how to do music therapy perfectly on Zoom. Like, no, we're still in the learning phase, and to give ourselves lots of space for that, because we're still navigating the changes. It's not like the changes happened and now we're getting used to it. We're actually still in the transition period while we're recovering simultaneously from all the stress that has happened. So it's like sort of this compounding stress that we're dealing with right now of trying to recover while trying to manage current stressors and still learning how to do this. What does it mean to be a music therapist right now?
Mhm, mhm. And you brought up such a good point about grief because
Mhm.
there really is a before pandemic life and a
Yeah,
after pandemic life, and so many things are just never gonna go be the
yeah,
same.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I see a lot of grief for, I see a lot of parents grieving, their children and the sort of what they've been missing out on the past few years of the normalcy of a school life, and but also the grief for our own clients too, what they can be missing out on too. And the a lot of us knows the power of music and how that can translate in certain arenas, and how sometimes it is just harder virtually. It doesn't mean it can't happen, it can, but feeling some misconnections sometimes, and that can be hard.
Yeah, yeah, those barriers that were there, both physical or virtual,
Mhm.
for safety definitely
Yeah.
created some different experiences, I think, that
Yes.
people were not always expecting.
Yes. Yeah.
So you had mentioned that you started your ebook and your program because you went through burnout. Are you able to share just a little bit about that experience from your own life?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to share my own experiences. Like I said before, I experienced burnout early on in my career. So I experienced burnout twice in my career. The first time this came on 2 years into my career. And it was a little bit surprising for me. I didn't recognize it as burnout at first because I was very confused as to how I could be burnt out when I love my career. I love being a music therapist. I love my job also. At the time, I was working on the trauma unit of an inpatient psychiatric hospital, and I loved that work. I did feel like it was a good fit for me. And there were most days I would look forward to going to work, but most days I would leave so exhausted, and I would spend my weekends like trying to recover from work. And then I was experiencing like, a change in attitude towards music or a change in my own relationship towards music. And the fatigue was really getting to me. And I was confused as to why I was feeling so fatigued when I guess I put a lot of shoulds on myself. Like you know, I, I should be more energetic. Like at the time I was in my late 20s, and I was like single, and like I was like I should be like having more fun. And I'm only 2 years into my career. Like I should be doing better than this. And also being so hard on myself kept me from seeing burnout. But you know, I've done a lot of self reflection on this and realized a lot of what was blocking me from seeing my own burnout were my own cultural values of, valuing hard work and just not complaining and, putting my head down and, doing my best. And I didn't want to seem ungrateful for the work I was doing. I also worked so hard to become a music therapist that I also didn't want to admit to myself that I was having a hard time and that I needed support. But I did get to a point where I was like, okay, something needs to change, that this is not sustainable. And so, one of the first things I did was to get myself a therapist. And this was helpful in rebalancing my energy because I was being a therapist to other people, now having my own therapist and being on the other side of the helping relationship was very beneficial in starting to rebalance my energy. And my therapist also helped me see what was going on in that I was experiencing burnout, that it is possible, and it was a safe place for me to be able to express what I was having a hard time with, because I couldn't necessarily, or I didn't necessarily want to admit this to like my family or friends. I wanted to seem like this strong, resilient person. But it also brought to light other things where a lot of times occupational burnout, it's not totally about work, too. For me at that time, there were other pieces of my life that just weren't in place at the time. And I had this very big desire to like see the world. Like I wanted to travel, but working a full-time job, I was employed, at this hospital that gave me 2 weeks off a year. Like that made it so hard to do what I wanted to do and follow some of my other passions that I had, were music therapy, which is one of them. And so what I ended up doing was saving up a bunch of money and quitting my job. And I took off and traveled for about 6 months. And that was a way of getting to know myself again, and seeing the world helped me just open my mind, but also open my heart. And part of my travels involved going to India. I lived at an ashram for a month, and that showed me what structured self-care actually looked like when someone set that structure for me. And so that helped me get to know myself a little bit better. And one thing I learned about myself was that, I actually don't want to be employed as a music therapist. I think I needed a little bit more freedom than what I had. And so that was one thing that wasn't working at my previous job, that was leading to my burnout, was that it wasn't actually a good fit for my personality, the work situation. And so when I recovered from that first instance of burnout, I decided I'm going to come back and start a private practice, because that would feel more aligned with who I was. It would also allow me to have more freedom and also make a little more money too than in my previous job. So I started a private practice, and that was so exciting to then be a business owner. And that's another totally different way of being a music therapist, but it was a little more fitting for my personality. But yet, a few years into that, guess what happened? I burnt out again. Like I felt that emotional exhaustion coming on. And I was like, oh no, like, why am I feeling so tired again? But when I did some inner work that time during that burnout experience, what I realized what was leading to my burnout was a lot of professional insecurity, where I wasn't feeling secure in my own clinical skills. Like I really wanted to improve who I was as a clinician, and just felt like there was a lot more room for improvement. Like I could have been doing better. And so my solution to burnout that time was to go back to school and get my master's degree. And while it might seem like counterintuitive, like I was already burnt out and tired, and then like to join a master's program seems like it might be more tiring, but it wasn't. It immediately connected me to a support system. So the other people in my master's program became a very important support to me, along with my professors and teachers, and the school. I went to St. Mary the Woods College, and that was such an enriching experience. And what I learned about self-care at that time was that I need to both nourish myself and release things at the same time. Part of my own self-care is that I like to nourish myself with information and knowledge. Like even now, every day I'm listening to podcasts or reading books. Like one of my favorite self-care activities is that at the end of the day, I can sit on my couch with a book and read. And like that fills my soul. But I do have this constant need to be learning. And also I do well in academic environments. That somehow just fits my personality too. And so, being a student again was energizing for me. And again, that's not going to work for everybody. So it's part of the know yourself kind of thing with self-care. But that did help energize me. And then when it came to write my thesis, I wrote my thesis on burnout and self-care in the music therapy profession. And that helped me understand my experiences of what I went through those 2 times I had burnout. I realized that I wasn't alone, that burnout is common in our profession, but I also realized there aren't a lot of resources for us. So my thesis became my ebook, the one I just mentioned, Resilience Over Burnout, a self-care guide for music therapists. And that's what started a lot of this work for me. But, I look back at my own experiences of burnout, and I do see how confused I was at the time. Burnout was such a confusing experience for me. and it was exhausting. And those two things are hard because it's, when you're in exhaustion, it's hard to figure out things that are confusing because you're already kind of mentally tired. But getting support was invaluable. And there were just a lot of things I couldn't see in my own experience because I was much too close to it. And I needed help replenishing myself. That, the word self-care can sometimes be misleading. Self-care doesn't mean you have to do it all on your own or it's just all about you, but self-care can involve other people and getting support. Self-care doesn't mean that, yeah, you're alone or, again, have to figure it all out by yourself.
I appreciate you sharing that story and for, being resilient and sticking with the therapy profession and being able to now give back. That's such a
Mhm.
wonderful thing that you found your niche and are able to help others.
Yeah, and it's such an honor too. And that was one big change that happened for me during the pandemic was I realized that I could actually help more clients if I'm helping the helpers. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I ended up closing my private practice to run the Self Care Institute full time because I realized that I will likely burn out again if I'm running the Self Care Institute and still running my music therapy private practice and I'm getting my PhD right now. I'm like, okay, I need to set some boundaries with myself. I need to learn from the past. I'm not going to let this happen again. I especially don't want to be going through burnout while I'm running the Self-Care Institute. That will feel very hypocritical. So I did have to make some hard choices. It was hard to let go of my clinical practice. I still do miss it, but I love working with other music therapists and with other helping professionals. Also, I mean, music therapists are have some of the biggest hearts, and we're trying our best. And I just like to think about back when I was going through burnout, what I wish was available and being able to provide that for somebody. And yeah, that brings me a sense of fulfillment too.
I want to touch on something you mentioned, which is so important, especially for the music therapists who are graduating and applying for first jobs, is not only finding a job that fits certain parameters in your life, but also your personality. That is,
Yes.
yeah, it's so important. And it's something that sometimes you don't know until you get into that particular position for 6 months, a year, 2 years to realize, like, oh, I'm not really a good fit for this kind of a position,
Hmm.
you know?
Hmm. Yes. Yes. And yeah, it does take time to realize that, but I do encourage professionals when you are looking for a new job and you're interviewing to know that you're interviewing the other person also, and to ask questions and to be honest and be able to appropriately express your own needs and concerns and desires too, as you are looking for a position that is a good fit for you.
And I definitely recommend asking about management styles because that is a huge
Mhm.
aspect of how
Yeah.
someone would or wouldn't gel with a company, for sure.
Yes.
So,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, hot tip out there. Before we go, do you have any last self care strategies or resources to mention specifically for music therapists?
Yeah. So for music therapists, as far as strategies go, I have a couple just general strategies that you can personalize for yourself. But one thing I've been talking about lately is self compassion. And that means, obviously having compassion for yourself. But what that can look like is being your own friend and being the kind of friend that you need. And to think about that, what kind of friend do you need? When are the times that you need patience? When are the times that you need kindness? But when are the times you need some tough love? Or, you need someone to give you some honest truths, or to, be a little bit stern with some boundaries with you for your own good. But being self compassionate can mean being your own friend. But for each one of us, that's going to look very different, and that's going to change throughout our lives. So I'd encourage you right now to just take a deep breath in and exhale and think about, what does it mean to be your own friend? What do you need right now? And to see how you can compassionately start to meet your needs in small ways. And so, with self care, it is very important to remember that small things make a difference. I talked about earlier, I went off and took off 6 months and went to India and whatever. Like, self care does not have to look like that. It can also mean taking a few breaths in, it can mean putting one hand over your chest, giving yourself a moment. Self-care can look like getting up and getting yourself a glass of water. Self-care can mean saying no to a certain invitation, or self-care can simply just be saying something like encouraging to yourself in your mind right now, saying, hey, like, I see you're doing the best you can. Like, yeah, like, thanks for doing what you did today. Like, you're doing good. You're doing good. Instead of that critical voice just taking over all the time. And so self-compassion, that involves self-kindness, self-patience. But one of my favorite go-to self-care practices, though, is just being able to take a breath when you need to, and knowing that that can be a very important symbol of agency for yourself, saying like, no, I do have some amount of control over my mind and my body. I can choose to take a breath. I can choose to fill and nourish my body with oxygen. I can choose to exhale and let go right now, and be able to give yourself moments like that when you need to. It's so common for us to deny ourselves self-care at the times when we need it the most. So, to bring it back to what I was saying about resilience at the, beginning of this was, resilience does not mean that you have to be strong all the time, but resilience can mean responding to stress with self-care, even in the smallest of ways. That it does matter, because you matter and we all matter here.
Yeah. I love that. And I love the idea of just taking a breath, because it really grounds us. And it's
Mhm.
something that we can even do before we step into the room to see a client or a patient, so that we're
Yes.
then more ready and present
Yes.
for them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And you can also do this in your sessions too. When it's appropriate, if you can, you could also do this with your client if it's appropriate, but you can also, when you need to, say, okay, I'm gonna take a breath before I sing this next song, and giving yourself that. And that is modeling self-care for your clients or anybody else who's in that room. And that can go a long way.
Yeah. That's a fantastic tip
Mhm.
to remember. For sure. I've been so wrapped up in our wonderful conversation that I forgot to ask, are there any warning signs that you typically see for music therapists, that they're like leading to the burnout, on that road? Are there maybe two or three warning signs that you've noticed in your studies and in your career path so far?
Yeah, so a few warning signs. One can be dread, like a feeling of dread either towards your work, towards a specific client, or even something about yourself as a professional. Like, if there is anything related to work where there's a sense of dread in there, I encourage you, if there is dread can be scary and uncomfortable, but dread is a signal to say, ooh, what is this about? And being able to hold it and talk about it with somebody. What we don't want is to stuff dread down and say, go away, and it just gets bigger within us, and we don't want it to turn into shame or something like that. But dread can be a warning sign there. Dread does not mean you're burnt out, but it can be a signal to look out for. Similar to dread, is sort of a cousin of dread, is apathy. So just feeling like apathetic towards your work in some way. Again, it could be towards your job, towards a client, towards music therapy, towards yourself. But apathy can be this very important warning sign to explore. Again, this is holding some information. And similar to that, anger and resentment. Like they're all sort of in the same family of experiences, but these are these experiences that are usually like delivering your boundaries in some way, but they are saying something needs to be attended to or that something needs to change, and to be able to change those things before it gets worse. That's a really good question.
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain that. I think that there are probably times in a music therapist or a caring profession's life that happens, and then it's good to know. It's good to look out for that.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And with that, that makes identity so important, and making sure you are in a situation where your identity is valued and you can be who you are. And like, yeah, like I talked about before, being a music therapist, we're often a professional minority, and being a minority is hard. But for many music therapists, they might be a minority in some other way too, and to be making sure they're valued as a person at their workplace, but also that they themselves are valuing themselves. And one thing I've been trying to work on, for myself and with other people, is to really explore what identity has to do with burnout and with self-care, and bringing this piece in, and making sure we're using appropriate language for ourselves, with ourselves and with each other. But it can also start with ourselves, using very compassionate language with ourselves. That does work. And when it comes to identity and burnout and self-care, what we do need to leave room for is for learning and for making mistakes. Even with our own identity, sometimes it will take some experimentation to see what works for us and what doesn't, either in certain job situations or with self-care, what's going to work and what's not going to work, whether, yeah, it's how we talk to ourselves, or how we choose to be in a certain situation, or how we're treated, either again internally or externally. And yeah, that is one thing I've been working on. This makes me think, early in the conversation, like I said, the word drum circle, like that's also a term I'm trying not to use anymore. So even to like correct myself and say something that might be more culturally appropriate, that's not misappropriating, cultural being more respectful of cultural practices, and maybe using a different word, and not using drum circle as a music therapy intervention, but using something else that then does respect other people's identities. And, I think when we're looking at respecting identities, for the most part, when it comes to music therapists, I'm not too concerned about us being respectful to each other. In general, we really are. I am concerned about us being respectful to ourselves. And that means when we ourselves are disrespected in some way, that we are able to then treat ourselves with kindness and nourish ourselves when that happens, but also lean on each other when we need to. Again, being a professional minority is not easy. We will be misrepresented in the media. Our jobs will be misunderstood. We will have to constantly be advocating for ourselves, but to not feel like we have to do that alone. There's so much going on right now, and there's so much learning happening, and it's wonderful that we are in this very important growth phase as human beings. But we do need to allow ourselves some space to be able to learn that. And I'm coming out with article. It's going to be published in Music Therapy Perspectives, I believe in November, but it's about the intersections of burnout, self-care, and race in the music therapy profession and in social justice. So yeah, you can keep your eye out for that too. But one thing I am talking about in that article is looking at, when we choose self-care, we are choosing compassion. So when we do choose to care for ourselves, we are contributing compassion into the world. When we deny ourselves self care, we're contributing to oppression. So when we deny ourselves self care, we're oppressing ourselves, and that contributes to oppression in the world. And so, just to give everyone something to think about with that, and that doesn't mean you have to be perfect with your self care, so you're not an oppressor, not like that. But when you take a look at yourself, to see the acts of kindness that you do give to yourself matters so much, because it is contributing to the overall compassion in this world, and that is very much needed right now.
You made such excellent points, and Ami, congratulations on your upcoming article. I definitely will be looking forward to that. And listeners, be sure to check out the show notes for links to Ami's websites, courses, and books. And of course, if you're feeling the symptoms of burnout, she's got a fantastic program. And I'm so blessed to have you on the show, not only this time for this more in-depth interview, but also for the first time. So please, listeners, feel free to check that one out as well. And links will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.